All right, joining us today here on Green with Envy, we are really excited to have this next guest. If you are subscribing to The Athletic, which you absolutely should because there is great coverage over there, you're going to be very familiar with one of my favorite works of each and every offseason for about the last 5 years or so. We have athletic writer Seth Partnow on here, who, of course, is the author, the man behind the scenes of the Tiers article, which, depending on who your favorite player is, you may or may not have an issue with. But, Seth, we are really excited to have you join the show today.
Thanks for having me. I've been accused of being a hater from every conceivable direction. So, this is the fourth year that I've done these publicly. This is sort of a similar exercise to what happens within teams. That kind of did a modified version of it to bring it to the public. And so this is the fourth annual edition of the player tiers.
And you know what? I love these, man. I love the debate that this kind of, I mean, it's the off season, right? You know, myself, Adam, Greg, we're always looking for content basically from, once summer league wraps up until training camp, unless we get little nuggets here and there, like it sometimes gets hard to kind of fill that space. And so I think this is a really great article that gives a different perspective to just, hey, here's the top 1, 2, 3, 4. But I think that tier ranking is something that is really unique and that we've tried to emulate with our show as well, too, when we talk about where players, what their status is within the league. But a question I'm always really curious about, and, it's human nature that when you have a large project, whether it's work related, home related, there's a lot of anxiety of just where the hell do I even start this? Because then once you get started, you can get into it and you can get going. So I'm curious, do you usually start at the top and work your way down, or is this at the bottom and then work your way up? What's typically the process behind the scenes to the teams?
The good news is since that this is the fourth year of doing it, and my way of thinking about the league is I think that the league is pretty sticky in terms of not wanting to. Guys have good seasons and bad seasons, but where players are sort of overall in the league changes. I don't want to say in geological time for the most part, but it's not like, well, he made jumpers for 2 weeks, so now he's the 10th best player in the league. I really want to avoid that. So starting from a standpoint of how I kind of viewed the league previously, it means it's more moving guys up and down and maybe slotting a few new guys in rather than, blank sheet of paper. So it's easier in that way. The first time was a little bit nerve wracking in that regard, but I was also helped by the fact that I done a fair amount of research on understanding what sort of the overall structure of the league should look like. And the reason why it's tiers and not rankings is, okay, there are some, it's not actual like discrete buckets, but it's more useful to think about it. But there are a certain number of players, give or take, every year who are at a certain level, and then more who are at the next level down, and then more who are at the next level down, and so on and so forth. And I think one of the things that we broadly speaking, is we get over-inclusive. I mean, if you ask someone to name everyone they say is a top 10 player, they're going to come up with 18 guys. And that's obviously not the case. And I think a big mistake that a lot of teams make is sort of not being as cold-eyed about saying, all right, our guy's pretty good. He's not that. Like, again, you're the Suns. You're very happy you have Devin Booker. He's not Steph Curry. And not eliding the distinction between the two is pretty important in sort of the self-evaluation of where are we at as a team.
How much does recency bias affect these? So, like you're doing these in the off season after a playoff run or multiple playoff runs for different teams. And some players may be historically good in the playoffs, but they just have a stinker through a series or two. How much does that kind of affect how you approach where you tier them? Do you try and be more inclusive to the regular season as well as the postseason, or do you struggle with that a little bit?
Struggle with it a little bit, but I think that my general rule is everyone gets one mulligan. Like someone has a bad, a bad playoff run, has a rough season, is injury play. Like, okay, especially if there are kind of circumstances surrounding it. Like, okay, I think not this past season, but the last season, Kevin Durant, when they got swept by the Celtics, It's like, okay, he was not good in that series, but he is by and large been an excellent playoff performer, and that team was an all-time mess. So we're gonna just get a little bit of a mulligan there.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was certainly a hard player for me to figure out where to slot in part because of sort of the dislocation of exiting from that situation in Brooklyn and then getting hurt right away when he got to Phoenix and that team never really coalescing. So he's almost on his, working off of 1.5 consecutive mulligans. And so of players who I'm watching very closely this year to see if they still belong, as highly as I have them is something that I'll be paying attention to all year. And that's something that having a list to work from helps as I know a little bit what the questions I need to have answered are.
So having said that, what is the hardest evaluation for you to make on this list? Is it that guy like Kevin Durant where he's got history? Like you said, some guys, they're going to get a mulligan and you can kind of figure out based off their history and present kind of where they slot in. Or is it more, a guy that's on the rise, maybe a Mikal Bridges that was a role player, then he got a chance to kind of shine on his own a little bit in Phoenix and then certainly a lot more when he goes to Brooklyn. Where do you find it being the most difficult within this list, which by the way, just for listeners, contains 125 players as the cutoff for the 5 tiers. So where do you find it hardest to distinct those evaluations?
I think that the sort of the older star, bad season or getting past it. That's
Father Time finally
coming time. Yeah, it's just like I'm surprised by how little pushback I've gotten from having LeBron is in tier 2 instead of tier 1 this year, which maybe makes me think I was a year late on it almost because it's now that's about right. Like he's like even the stanniest of stans will kind of it's fair to that, especially when compared with the players who are ahead of him. So that's one. The other part is a little bit the Bridges point you're talking about, but it's the distinction between the elite role player and the okay star profile kind of player. And the avatar for this has been for the last couple of years has been Brandon Ingram, who, if he's like, what is the level of a team that he's the best player on compared to the other kind of best player wings? And yet at the same time, if you asked, Derek White to take on Brandon Ingram's role, it would be ugly. But if you ask Brandon Ingram to take on Derek White's role, I'm not sure that there is a lot of evidence that that sort of defensive and connective bit that sort of a third, fourth, fifth guy can have, and the importance of having those guys on a playoff team, a championship level team, can't be understated. So within the lens of looking at it, this is, assuming reasonable health, who is going to be more helpful towards winning a championship this year? Is it that elite role player, or is it the guy who can be a okay high usage guy? But if he's your high usage guy again, where are you going? That's always a hard one for me. And that's typically the one that I get the most pushback on. That category of players, the one I get the most pushback on, because I think that while it's true that individual offense and shot creation is the single most important skill in the NBA, the difference between doing that at an elite or very good or excellent level and doing it that is a pretty good, okay level, there's a big gap in sort of the value between that. And there's guys who fall just on the good side of that line, which is maybe a Jaylen Brown or something who has some other attributes that help him. And there are players who fall just on the other side of that line who are typically the ones that I have been much lower on than consensus, with Ingram being sort of the avatar for that group.
And to contextualize for any Celtics fans that are only watching Celtics games, would you kind of use Malcolm Brogdon as Boston's version of Brandon Ingram as that avatar in this discussion?
He's not quite at that. There was maybe a time where he was approaching that level. I think he's moved beyond being that level as a player, both because of kind of injuries have taken a little bit of a toll on him, and Sort of his skill level has settled at a certain area that's lower than that a little bit. Some of that is just the difference in, body type.
That's fair.
A 6'8" guy with wingspan and a 6'4" tank. I mean, whatever height we want to call Brogdon. Like they're just different. They're just different profiles of things they can do.
That's fair.
So this is a good transition point. I want to start kind of going through the tiers and using the Celtics as our way to kind of climb down this theoretical ladder here. And, something that really stood out to me, I went through and I kind of went team by team to see how many guys from each team, made this list of what's ultimately 125 guys. And I know you do state in the first article, this list could really theoretically be up to 150 guys. It's that 5A. It's really hard to, kind of figure out where that cutoff is. But with the 125 guys that are, listed on there, the Celtics have 7 guys across these 5 tiers. That's only matched by the Warriors as far as the volume or the quantity of how many, players that they have. So let's start at the top. And, the highest ranked Celtic, no shock, no surprise, it's Jason Tatum. He falls just short of entering into that tier 1 level. And you even mentioned, and this is really, I do think, one of the funnest debates in the NBA right now, Jason Tatum versus Devin Booker. And I think this is extremely appropriate time to have that conversation where, FIBA World Cup, we're recording this on a Friday afternoon. FIBA World Cup just started. By the time this podcast is released, USA will have played their first game. Neither guy playing in the FIBA World Cup, but you can likely expect both of them to be back on Team USA for the Olympics. And with Durant, LeBron, Steph all starting to age, this really seems kind of like the competition for the face, quote unquote, of USA basketball is Jason Tatum versus Devin Booker. And as you were breaking down the two of them, you even mentioned that for Jason Tatum, 90% of the time, he's a tier 1 guy, most of the time, 90%. But there's that 10% that leaves him still in this 2A category. So if you could, I'd love for you to kind of talk us through, number 1, Jason Tatum versus Devin Booker, and then how you end up with them in 2A versus, I noticed there was no 1C category, just 1A, 1B, but preventing them from quite getting to that tier 1 level.
Sure. Let me take the lack of 1C is from an empirical standpoint. There's 3 to 7 guys, generally speaking, who should be tier 1 in any given season. So since I got to tier 1B with 6 guys, and some people have said, well, maybe I should have had it slightly different in terms of where Steph Curry was relevant to Giannis and Jokic, or Jokic should have been 1A, all that, whatever. Like those were the 6 guys, and it's those 3 and Luka, Embiid, and KD. Now, again, with the explanation for why I still had KD that high that I gave earlier. The differentiating factor is, I think, again, it's that for Tatum, it is that 10%. And I think that's a little bit of a microcosm of the Celtics as a whole, in that, they go through large stretches of games, of seasons, looking like the best team in the league. And then you guys have seen it over the last couple of years in the playoffs. Like, we're up 8. There's 5 minutes left. We're just going to stop playing basketball. Oh, crap, we lost. And then now it's a 7-game series against, a team we drastically out-talent in the Heat. This is not this year's, but last year. Like, the fact that series was even close enough that Jimmy Butler had the ball in the air in Game 7.
In which, by the way, every Celtics fan in the world thought that shot was going in.
Yeah. I mean, I think that they had no business like letting it be that close. And it was, credit to the Heat for sticking around and being willing to take advantage of that. But that's much more self-inflicted. And I think that's with Tatum, there are times where, the handle gets loose. There are times when he does not finish with any sort of force inside. There are lots of times where he gets to the basket, thinks he got fouled, and instead of defending, wants to talk about not getting a foul call. And that turns into, every time that turns into a fast break the other way. It doesn't take that many of those. Each one of those is worth, from a theoretical standpoint, it's worth about a third of a point. And we're talking in, NBA, where the difference between like the best players and the next group down is maybe like, 2 points per 100. You start to give those thirds of points away multiple times per game. It's sort of like guys who are decent defenders but foul a lot. Doesn't take that many extra of those for you to negate a lot of the good things you do. And so that's where like that 10% like is enough in relation to the 90% of awesome. The 90% where he is a great offensive initiator, is a reliable playmaker out of the pick and roll. Taken as a whole, balance, because you can't just cherry pick the good parts. That's what keeps him out of being in that top group. And the contrast with Booker, who I think is, again, we talked about the difference in frame, between Brogdon and Ingram. I think that same dynamic exists a little bit between Tatum and Booker. Like Tatum's ceiling is higher because of the just the physical nature of it, but Booker is much more frequently and consistently nearer his peak. And that's the part that makes the debate between them interesting. Like Tatum could be better, but on any given median night, any given fourth quarter, who do you trust more? And then it becomes a lot more interesting. And I think based on recent history, you could easily prefer Booker, but it's not cut and dried, and that's how they end up in the same tier.
Who do you think out of those two is more likely to make the ascension to tier 1 by next offseason?
I think Tatum is more likely, just because, again, I think there's the sort of production to talent. There's more of a gap between the production to ceiling talent than there is for Booker. Now, Booker is a player who has gotten tons better and continues to add to his game. I think this past year, and really the past 2 years, he's come on tremendously defensively, which is part of what has been impressive to me about him. How much more is there? I don't know. He's going to get every chance to show it this season, though. So it's not a situation like some players who, they have questions about them and their team situation means we're not going to know. I think there's a number of years where I had suspicions that Nikola Jokic would be just fine with, contention level talent around him, but with Jamal Murray not playing and Michael Porter Jr. injured, you didn't get a clean run at the question. I think he answered that in the most emphatic way possible this past year, but before that, it was an open question. But both players are in situations where they should get a chance to at least address the questions that I have about them.
Moving on, you've got Jaylen Brown in tier 3A to be specific. Just signed a new contract, monster Supermax. The biggest, you saying there's a discussion around who could be the face of Team USA. I know we'll mention that. The biggest discussion point around Jaylen at the moment is he worth the contract value both now and by the end of the deal? What do you see from him that made you put him in 3A as opposed, along with Mitchell? I can see here you got Jaren Jackson, Anthony Edwards, Bam. So he's in that level of guy. So I'm just wondering what you see, whether he could make that ascension to tier 2 and whether you feel like that ascension would be comparative to the contract value.
So starting with the contract, like in just linear terms, no, he's not worth that contract and he won't be. But relative to the Celtics situation, they're not, they would have no way to replace him in their championship level team, and it's not my money, so who cares? It's sort of like it's the biggest contract in the NBA until the next round of contracts are signed.
For now.
Yeah. So and also, like, given the importance of top level players, that especially for top level teams, figuring out the value of the contract is a little more challenging because you can't just look at like regular season wins. It's also how much does this guy help us in the playoffs, and that's kind of the economic calculation of that is challenging. I certainly don't have a good approach to it from a strictly numerical statistical standpoint. In terms of his likelihood of getting higher than that, I think he's probably, barring what would be very unusual skill development at this point in his career, I think this is really his peak. I don't think we need to go into the foibles of the left hand and stuff like that. But
Celtics fans have heard enough about the left hand.
Yeah. I will say that I might actually be a little higher than Brown than some people, and part of it is he's almost in some ways he's turned the relative skill deficit into an advantage, because sometimes the Celtics need some dynamism, and he is very straightforward. He is one move going to the basket, and there are a lot of times where that's the best thing they have going for them. Now, there are also times where that leads to turnovers and fast breaks the other way and all that fun stuff. But I think that if you sort of put the consistency of Brown's like attacking demeanor in Tatum's skill set, that's an interesting, like that's a tier one player of some form. So it's almost like he's confidenced his way to the peak of his ability.
And you're kind of hitting on something that I always say about Jaylen Brown. I think where he's at is one of the toughest roles you can be, where you're very clearly the second best guy, but on certain nights you could be the best guy, but it's knowing when to kind of go for that. And like you said, sometimes that, straightforward approach, perfect. So Jason Tatum didn't have it tonight, or, ideally we wish we saw this obviously in game 7 work out better after Jason Tatum rolls his ankle early in the game. Sometimes it leads to turnovers, but that's a really tough position to say tonight, I'm going to have to be the guy. And other nights just kind of be waiting like, okay, I got to take my opportunities when they come. And that's a really tough position for, someone like Jaylen Brown. And I think within that tier 3 that you have him in, I think throughout that, there's like 3 types of guys that I generally see in that list. One is kind of up and coming guys that are still ascending, the Anthony Edwards, Tyrese Halliburton, where this is part of their progression. You see, guys who are miscast as the best really good players, stars, as you would say for this, for this exercise, that are miscast as the best player on their team. Bradley Beal, formerly when he was in Washington, DeRozan, someone of that, where you're not going to win a championship. They're good players, but you're not winning a championship with them as your best player. And then there's a bunch of the best number 2 guys that you can have in the league. A lot of them, are going to find their way into 2C, 3A, 3B type category. And that's Jaylen Brown's role, but it can be a really, really difficult position to be in.
And I think it's worthwhile also, talking about the range we're talking about, like the bottom of tier 2, we're talking about like, the guys at the bottom end of top 20. We started getting to tier 3. We're in like the 20s and the 30s. And so that I think that's helpful to also calibrate, what we're talking about. And if you're the if you have the 25th best player in the league on your team and he's your best player, the math is such that of course he's not going to, you're going to have to do some pretty extraordinary things from a team building perspective around him to have it be.
You better have 8 guys between 40 and 100,
right?
if you're thinking of championship aspirations.
And even that is challenging, because then you run into, okay, well, the part of the synergy of the Nuggets this year is they had 5 dudes, really 6, but those 6 dudes, and it's like they knew exactly where they were. Like, okay, maybe some nights it's Bruce Brown, some nights it's Michael Porter Jr. But for the most part, everyone has their slot and they know what they're doing. And having that level of sort of consistency and trust and all that, I think is also, in practical terms, is very beneficial, because, all right, we know what we're doing, let's go do it.
Yeah, and real quick before we leave tier 3, to Adam's kind of question earlier about like recency bias, and not even necessarily recency biases, but balancing regular season versus postseason. I look at kind of Jamal Murray versus Jaylen Brown, right? Jamal Murray never made an all-star team, never made an all-NBA team. His regular season stats, good, not great. But then you see what he did in the postseason. You see what he's also done in previous postseasons. Mm-hmm. And, we've had this debate on our show as well, too, about, kind of Jamal Murray versus Jaylen versus Donovan Mitchell, all guys that kind of live in the similar area. And, we keep defaulting to, when the lights are brightest, Jamal Murray's been the best of these guys, and he's done it multiple times now. And so it's hard not to say that, Jamal Murray has a higher standing in the league than, a guy like Jaylen Brown. And it's not miles apart, but it's hard not to say that almost definitively right now.
And I think the other bit is the part you talked about being the second best guy who sometimes needs to do the other thing. No, I don't think anyone has, it's hard to remember a guy who's done it as sort of seamlessly as Murray has done that with Jokic. I mean,
part of that's Jokic's nature, right? Is that he doesn't mind deferring to them.
And the compliment, but even, I think that Dwayne Wade on the Heat was a better player than Jamal Murray is, but there was more kind of tension between how LeBron played and how Wade played. So there's almost more the way that Jokic and Murray are more than the sum of their parts playing together is something that is I don't want to say it's unique, but that's pretty high level also. And I think being able to fit in with other great players is an important thing to consider when we're talking about, the guys who aren't necessarily the context creators that the really top guys are. It's as in many ways, this is, degree of difficulty of fitting this guy into a championship construction. And that's why some players, like if we were just talking about who is the, best guy at helping build a regular season winning team versus a playoff, like a guy like Domantas Sabonis is very helpful in one category. And then he's like, okay, well, how do we fit him? Assuming that, with bowing to some realities of team construction, okay, how do you practically build a true contender with and around this guy? And the pathways become very narrow. And so that is why, like, someone like him, even though he's legitimately an all-star, gets legitimate all NBA consideration, is not even in tier 3, is in tier 4.
That kind of leads me on to more of a team-based question, like team building. So we've got Jason Tatum, tier 2A, top 10 guy. Would you agree top 10?
I mean, he's in the group of, like, it's a group of 5 for the 4 remaining spots in the top 10. We've got for your listeners, you got the 6 in the tier 1, and then tier 2A is I believe it's Tatum, Booker, LeBron. Who else did I put in there? Help me out. I forget.
I've got it. I'm just
Jimmy Butler, and one more, I think.
So you got LeBron, Kawhi, Jimmy, Jason, Devin.
Yeah, I forgot about Kawhi because, of course.
Okay, so we could say top 12, just to be fair. So you've got your top 12 guy, then you've got Jaylen Brown, top 25 to 30, 35 range, and then you come down and you've got Derek White, Robert Williams, Kristaps Porzingis in your tier 4A to be specific, top 50 to 75 type range, I'm assuming. Mm-hmm. So now all of a sudden the Celtics have 5 guys in the top 75, high level potential, depending on the night, top 10 guy, potential top 25. That's a nice little duo there. And now you're rounding out with these 3 other guys in that top 75. And the only other team I think you've got with that many players in that height, in that region, is the Warriors, who obviously are the Warriors. I'm just wondering how you see that kind of all gelling together. As you were just speaking about, everyone in Denver knew their role, knew exactly what they needed to do. For Boston, that hasn't always been apparent. Sometimes it feels like people are overstepping their role, or they're underplaying their role to a degree. So I just want to get your opinion on those 3 guys being, like, the key part of that rotation as well.
Sure. So Denver also has 5 guys kind of tier 4 and above. Their starting lineup. But I think that, the way I interpret that is they are a championship level team that hasn't quite figured, and made their level of success over the past several years is that of a contention level team that hasn't quite made it over the top yet. And you can, we can point to any number of reasons why kind of they've come up short, and a lot of it is of their own doing. And I think, some alteration of that dynamic is probably why you saw them bring in Kristaps Porzingis for Marcus Smart to sort of give a different look there. So from a talent standpoint, the only real problem they have is when you're coming up against the very best teams in the league, you probably don't have the best player on the court, because you're going to run into a Giannis, you're going to run into a Jokic, you're going to run into, into Curry or something like that. Or you play Miami and their best guy and your best guy are similar levels, and their best guy is better than your best guy, sort of in the moment. And that can happen too. I mean, two guys, at the similar level, one's going to win, one's going to lose. I don't think that is like an immutable logic that, well, they won this series, so he's definitively better.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that, sometimes you get the bear, sometimes the bear gets you. And so I guess a long wind of saying is like, yeah, they are a talented enough team to be a finalist, to win the NBA championship. There's 5, 6, 7 teams that of whom you can say that, and only one can win in any given year. So the fact that they haven't done it yet doesn't prove that they aren't at the level to be able to do it. Maybe they are at the level where other teams are more likely in a given year. And that's, again, a function of Tatum being that slight step down from even like, a Luka or something like that. But I think as a Celtics fan, there's only a few other teams that are in that level of talent. So you got to be pretty happy from there.
Yeah. And, speaking of that, that level of talent, I think that's, we've talked about in our show a bunch, that's the trade-off with Porzingis for Marcus Smart, is you're upping, your overall talent. Of course, now the way that we've kind of phrased it, as we think the ceiling's higher, the floor is a little bit lower because you have some more injury risk. You're taking out a guy that's been the staple of your team for 9 years. So, you are adding some risk, but I do think that you're increasing that ceiling. What is your view on the Porzingis for Smart move, and where you think that changes the Celtics or maybe keeps them in a very similar standing to, that championship competitive level?
I think that the tread was maybe starting to wear on Smart, and I think that there's almost as much of a political benefit to it. I think Derek White's a better player at this point in their careers than Smart, and so who's going to close games? Ooh, Wanny, you've got Derek White closing over Marcus Smart. Oh, wave our hands.
We started campaigning for Derek White to close games pretty early on the show. We were very much in the camp of, there was always kind of at least one guy who was going to be on the fence of closing. And we decided at a certain point that, listen, it's probably Marcus, because Derek's been that awesome. You're going to keep at least one of those bigs out there. And then you get the Jays. So by process of elimination, it would kind of default just had to be Marcus.
And so there's that. I think that, giving another, look, especially as Al Horford starts to show his age a little bit. All three of their big guys, you have some concerns about availability, but maybe the overlapping nature of it means you can either sustain an injury to one of them or get them to sort of nurse each other through the regular season and get to the playoffs in a good spot. And like Porzingis quietly had perhaps his best season last year. There's always the injury concerns with him. Obviously, he's not playing in the World Cup. How much should we be worried about a guy deciding to not play in the World Cup with, a sort of a nebulous injury like plantar fasciitis? By and large, you'd say, yeah, he decided he didn't want to play. With a player with Porzingis' injury history, you naturally have a little bit of worry about that. So it also kind of doesn't matter where he is in October. You care about where he is in April. But then just the adding of a little bit more offensive dynamism. I mean, Porzingis is a guy who, it may not always be the prettiest thing, but he's certainly a guy who is more adept at creating offense, at least for himself, than Marcus Smart was. From a spacing standpoint, I mean, having to contend with a 7'3" guy who can shoot out to 28 feet is that presents a different problem. I mean, Al Horford has certainly made himself into a very good shooter, but he's probably more of a wings and down guy, whereas some of the pick and pop options are very high. Drag screen action you can get into with Porzingis, and then you can do that without necessarily giving much away on the defensive end, because he is a very good rim protector. So the mix and match and combos you can do, and the playoffs are a little bit about being a Swiss Army knife and being able to respond to multiple scenarios. I mean, you can play. Do you play with just Porzingis? Can Porzingis and Williams play together? Can Porzingis and Horford play together in a lineup that can play, 5 out while still being big and defensively solid? There's so many different ways that they can go about things that I think that while there are things you will miss about Marcus Smart, I have there's a suspicion also that, and this is something that you guys can maybe answer for me more than I can. There's talk about taking away the heart and soul of the team. Well, the heart and soul of the team has this penchant for across 3 different coaches of having these late game meltdowns. And yeah, okay, you can put that on Tatum and Brown and Brad Stevens and Ime Udoka and Joe Mazzulla. That's fine. But Marcus Smart has also been a common denominator of that. And just wondering if maybe a different, overall vibe might. Because, I mean, whatever you think of Marcus Smart, there's no question that he's a lot. And, it's mostly that's net positive, but in this one aspect, has it maybe contributed to that problem? Maybe. I don't know. I think it's certainly plausible. So to me, I always appreciate when teams are good and realize we still need to get better instead of saying, nope, we're good enough, run it back. It's like, what's the downside of not trying to get better? But anyway, that's a whole other soapbox.
I just want to touch on you were talking about the different combinations you can run with Porzingis, and the only concern I have, because I'm quite high on the Porzingis edition, the only concern I have is the Celtics like to run double big. I see the vision offensively with Porzingis and Rob Williams on the floor together. Obviously, the spacing allows Rob to be the lob threat and do his slip screens and what have you. But defensively, I'm not sure how well that fits together. Last season, teams really figured out how to counter Rob being that kind of weak side roamer, where you'd put him on the worst shooter on the weak side corner. And teams just started running pin downs or handoff actions to get a good shooter in the corner, and then Rob can't rotate over anymore. And if you do that, and then you've got Porzingis playing drop, it feels like you're one defender short, because now Rob's susceptible to being beat off the dribble or being pinned down and not being able to rotate back over. So I'm just wondering how you'd look at that from a team building standpoint and be like, we can make this work by X.
So I think that the teams figuring that out was not so much about exploiting Williams per se, as it was about removing him as a help guy.
Yeah.
You already got, well, if Porzingis is there, then you already got that help guy. And I think Williams, I think is when he's right, I think he is part of the reason I'm so high on him. And I've been like high on him since he was in college. Part of the reason I'm so high on him is I think he is very underrated in his ability to guard out on the perimeter in terms of on switches, on what would, theoretically be mismatches. So fine, run your stuff to put Robert Williams in spots. Like, as long as we're not ending up with or you're not ending up with I went Hubie Brown for a second there. As long as we're not ending up with Williams spending whole stretches of games getting switched on to, the elite pull-up jump shooting shot creators, your Steph, your Luka, your Dame. You can do that in a pinch, but as long as that's not an every play thing, I would almost welcome teams to, well, we're going to try to neutralize Robert Williams by moving him around with Porzingis on the floor. It's like, okay, well, we still got Porzingis is not as good a rim protector as Robert Williams, but he's still a well above average interior defender. And, Williams can chase relative to players of kind of his size and interior defensive capabilities. Not that many of them guard on the perimeter as well as he does.
Yeah, and I think to a lot of what you're saying, Seth, that's where I feel pretty comfortable that whether it's Porzingis and Rob, we've seen Rob and Al play together, whichever combination of those 3, you could run them out there individually. And I think any of the combination, you can find a way to make that work. Would that be kind of aligned with how you're feeling about you have the opportunity to mix and match because,
Yeah.
versatility is going to be king depending on who you're playing.
And there are some matchups where you're not going to be able to play both of the like two bigs, and
Exactly.
or you might not want to all the time. And if we're talking about a deep dissection of the Celtics roster, that's almost where the loss of Smart is almost as much about their depth in terms of perimeter play. In terms of depending on how you feel about Peyton Pritchard or whoever else, but you've got 4 guys you feel pretty good about, at least one of whom is pretty injury prone, and then after that, it's a lot of I don't know, pretty quickly, and so that's.
I was gonna say, I think you mentioned the Nuggets, right? How they have kind of 6 guys, and they just like that's who they ride with, and that's their 6. And I think for the Celtics, it's a similar model. Health, obviously health being a big thing, but then in the regular season, kind of just figuring out, all right, with these 7 guys, and you'll get in the regular season, you'll get your Pritchard in there, you'll get O'Shea Brissett, you'll get Sam Hauser, whoever else in the mix. But in the playoffs, if you have those 7 guys, and if you can, not an exact apples to apples comparison with the Nuggets, but in your own way, find out what that mix is with those 7 guys. That's what will ultimately, at least for me, probably be the biggest differentiator come playoff time.
And I think the to push it back on you a little bit, I think what you would find is that the Nuggets guys, relatively speaking, have just that little bit more versatility. And some of that is like there is not the Celtics do not have an equivalent of Aaron Gordon.
Yeah,
I think Aaron Gordon and Derek White are reasonably similar level of players, but at least for the range of sort of roles and positions that the two teams have, Gordon fills a hole that for the Nuggets that White doesn't really do. For you can play big or small, everything in between, and Aaron Gordon can probably be on the floor. And does White offer quite the same range of different things that he can do, especially defensively? Like, he can guard 1 through 3. Gordon can credibly guard 1 through 5, and just that is
and that's where Marcus Smart was the closest thing the Celtics had to that previously.
And I would say, just again, based on size, Gordon at this point in his career is a notch or 3 above Smart in terms of being that sort of multifaceted. What do you need defender?
Yeah, absolutely. And Seth, we've kept you here long enough, man. I want to let you get your weekend started here, but we really appreciate you joining the show here. As I mentioned, this is one of my favorite article series, I should say. It's not just one article, it's 5 separate articles that runs each offseason for the last 4 years. So I hope that you definitely keep doing this. But anything that you got coming up here that you want to just plug real quick and let the people know, or where they can follow you and find you at?
You can follow me on Twitter at Seth Partnow. I'll have various basketball content coming out over the course of the year. Check us out weekly. It's sort of bi-weekly during the off season, but Nerd or She Wrote on the Athletic NBA show with my guys Mo Dakhil and Dave Dufour. That's always a good time. We're entering our 5th season of doing that. So we have I think we've hit we have a pretty good vibe together, and I really enjoy doing that show. So that's, I think, the thing I would encourage people to check out the most.
Awesome, man. Well, appreciate you stopping by here. Always fun, and hopefully we'll connect again with you here soon.
Thanks a lot, guys.